You ever believe in something so deeply, only to watch it shatter right in front of you? I used to believe in family. I thought they'd always be there. I thought blood mattered. But I learned the hard way sometimes the people you expect the most from are the ones who let you down the fastest. I'm Noah. I'm 34 years old, living in San Antonio, Texas. I own a small interior design firm, nothing flashy, but it pays the bills. I'm not wealthy, but I've worked my way up enough to live comfortably. I've got a loving wife, Mia, and an 8-year-old daughter, Zoe, who is the light of my life. We live in a modest house with a backyard where Zoe likes to chase butterflies and yell at squirrels. I work hard. I stay late. I sacrifice sleep just so that Mia and Zoe can have a life that's stable. Not luxurious, but safe. That's all I ever wanted. But my parents? Different story. My mom and dad, Mark and Evelyn, have always been obsessed with appearances. You know the type. Perfect hair. Perfect Instagram feed. Fancy furniture. Lavish dinners with friends they barely like. They run a long-standing furniture business passed down from my grandfather. It's successful enough that they can throw catered wine nights and drive shiny SUVs. But to them, success isn't about happiness, it's about image. About status. I have a younger sister, Bella. She's 31. She's their golden child. I mean, growing up, if I got straight A's, it was like, good, as expected. But when Bella got a B+ in biology, they practically threw a freaking pizza party. I got into Austin with scholarships. They barely blinked. Bella enrolled in a local community college. Boom. Surprise farewell trip to New York. Yeah, that's the dynamic. So I grew up independent. Built my own path. No help, no expectations. I accepted that. Until the day came when I needed them not for me, but for Zoe. That was the day everything fell apart. I met Mia at a DIY expo. Yep, super random. She was looking for ideas to spruce up her classroom. She's a kindergarten teacher, always smiling, always humming some silly tune. We hit it off over coffee and shared sarcasm. Fast forward a year, we were married. Fast forward another 2, and Zoe was born. Tiny hands, loud lungs, and a smile that could melt glaciers. Those were the best years of our lives. But also the hardest. Running a business, raising a kid, and paying rent in Texas isn't exactly a fairy tale. We weren't broke, but we cut corners where we thought it was safe. One of those corners? Health insurance. Mia had basic coverage through her school, but for me and Zoe, we figured we'd upgrade when the business stabilized. Biggest mistake of my life. It started one January when Zoe was just 3. She got a cough. Nothing serious at first. We gave her soup, rubbed her back, read her books. But days turned into weeks. The cough stuck around. Then came fatigue, loss of appetite, a wheezy breath that made my stomach knot. One evening, I came home from a client meeting to find Mia holding Zoe in her arms, our little girl limp, her breathing shallow. She whispered, "Noah, something's wrong, really wrong." We rushed to the ER. The test came back. Congenital lung abnormality, a mass compressing her airway. The doctor said it was rare but serious. She needed emergency surgery, immediately. Otherwise, she could lose the ability to breathe on her own or worse. My hands were trembling when they showed me the bill, $120,000. And before they could begin, they needed financial proof that we could pay. No insurance, no operation. I felt the world tilt. I wasn't just scared. I was ashamed. I had let my daughter down in the worst way possible, but I wasn't about to give up. We had maybe $15,000 in savings. Mia's parents offered everything they could, about $20K, but we were still far from the goal. And then, against my better judgment, I did the one thing I swore I'd never do. I went to them, to my parents, Mark and Evelyn. They were throwing some huge garden party for Bella's engagement string lights, hired violinists, waiters in black ties. I walked in through the side gate, soaked in stress, heart pounding. My mom was laughing with her friends, wine glass in hand. My dad was by the grill, talking business with some guy in a blazer. "Mom, Dad, I need to talk to you. It's serious." They looked annoyed. My mom glanced at my clothes like I was tracking dirt onto her patio. "Can it wait?" she asked. "No," I said. "It's Zoe. She's sick, really sick." Their expressions didn't change. I explained everything: the diagnosis, the cost, the urgency. Silence. I begged not for the full amount, but for anything. Just enough to begin the surgery. My mom set down her wine glass. Noah, we've already spent over $300,000 in Bella's wedding. Canceling now would be embarrassing. My father folded his arms. We told you years ago you should have gotten insurance. I was stunned. And Bella? She stood there in her glittery dress, looking at me like I was ruining her night. I turned to her. Please, anything. She shook her head. You always make everything about you, Noah. That's when I broke. I dropped to my knees, in front of all their guests, in front of people I didn't know. I begged. I'm not asking for me, I'm begging you for my daughter. And they turned away. Not one of them moved. Not one hand reached out. Not even a whisper of concern. My mom just muttered, "You're making a scene." That was the moment I realized I didn't have a family anymore. I stood up, my face flushed with humiliation and fury. Thanks for the reminder, I said. Now I know who I'll never call again. And I left. As I walked back to my car, the sky opened up and it started pouring. I sat behind the wheel, soaked and broken. I cried for the first time in years, but I didn't stay down for long. Because Zoe needed me, and if her blood family wouldn't save her, then I'd find a new family who would. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by Zoe's hospital bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest under that pale blue blanket, her tiny hand resting on a stuffed bunny, tubes and wires snaking around her like vines. I kept wondering how we ended up here, how the people who raised me could just walk away. Mia sat beside me, exhausted but quiet, strong in a way I wasn't. At one point, her mom walked in with 2 bags, one filled with food, the other with cash. She didn't say much, just placed it all on the side table and wrapped her arms around Mia. Eat something, she whispered. You both need to stay strong for her. I felt something burn in my throat, not because of the cash or the food, but because it was the first time that day someone had looked at us and cared. That night, Mia's dad sat across from me in the waiting room. He didn't judge, didn't say you should have done this or why didn't you do that. Just sipped his coffee and asked one simple question, how much more do you need? I told him the truth, we were still about $80,000 short. He nodded slowly, then leaned forward. We'll sell the RV. It's old, but someone will buy it. That'll give you a chunk. I stared at him, stunned. That RV was his retirement dream. He and his wife had been saving for years to travel once they both retired. You don't have to do that, I said quietly. His reply was simple. We do have to. She's our granddaughter. That was it. No strings, no guilt trips, no conditions, just love. The next few days became a blur of desperation and determination. I sold my car, not least sold. The dealer lowballed me, but I didn't argue. Gone. We liquidated every cent of our savings, emptied our emergency funds. I even closed the little investment account I'd been building since college. Watching that balance hit zero made my chest tighten, but I kept telling myself this isn't for stuff. This is for Zoe. Mia reached out to friends and coworkers. One teacher from her school brought over an envelope with $300 and a note that said, "For Zoe." From someone who believes in miracles. People the first hadn't spoken to in years started messaging. Some sent cash. Some just sent prayers. Both mattered. I even had an intern from my firm barely out of college pull me aside and say, I don't have much, but here's $500. My mom had cancer when I was 6. Someone helped us. It's my turn. That nearly broke me. But even after all that, we were still short. About 40 grand. I remember sitting on the curb outside the hospital, head in my hands, wondering what else we could sell. I'd already listed our couch, my laptop, Zoe's old crib, anything that wasn't nailed down. People were buying, but slowly. We didn't have time. And then, just as I was about to lose hope, Mia's dad called again. Noah, he said calmly, how much more? I hesitated. 40,000. There was a pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. We're selling the house. I thought I misheard him. What? You heard me. We're putting the house on the market. We've talked about it. We can downsize. Maybe rent for a while. Doesn't matter. What matters is Zoe. I stood there in stunned silence, wind knocking the words out of me. These people who owed me nothing were giving everything. They didn't look at spreadsheets. They didn't ask for payback. They didn't calculate ROI. They just loved. And in that moment, I realized something gut-wrenching. Mia's parents were more of a family to me than my own ever were. 3 days later, we had the full amount. I wired it to the hospital. The surgeon came in, nodded, and said, "We're good to go. She's in safe hands." The moment they wheeled Zoe into the operating room, I felt like I was handing over my heart. Time slowed. Every minute felt like an hour. I sat in the hallway, staring at a blank wall, gripping Mia's hand until both our knuckles turned white. We didn't talk. We didn't cry. We just waited. 4 hours later, the doctor stepped out. "Successful," he said with a tired smile. "She's going to be okay." I didn't even hear the rest. I just collapsed into the nearest chair and finally exhaled. The next few weeks were a quiet kind of hell. Zoe couldn't run or jump. She could barely whisper. Every breath was precious. Every win, like sitting up or laughing softly, felt like a miracle. We slept in shifts, took turns feeding her, cleaning her, reading her stories, until we passed out on the floor. But slowly, steadily, she got better. The color returned to her cheeks. Her giggle came back. One day she said, "Daddy, I want to play tag." I just hugged her so tight, she squealed. That day, I looked at Mia and whispered, "We made it." But I wasn't the same man anymore. Something inside me had changed. I had begged. I had sacrificed. I had watched people who had nothing give everything, while those who had everything gave nothing. And I knew right then that I would never beg again. Not for money, not for help, not for love. From that point forward, I was going to build a life so strong that no one could ever put my family in that kind of danger again. It started slowly. I returned to work part-time while Zoe recovered. I poured everything I had into my company. Late nights, early mornings. Every design, every project, I treated it like it was a way out of the darkness. I started taking on larger clients, redesigning office spaces, then small hotels. Word spread, people noticed. By the time Zoe was back to school, my firm had doubled in size. And I wasn't just building rooms anymore. I was building security, not just for me, for Mia, for Zoe, for the people who had believed in us when we had nothing but hope and hospital bills. 1 year later, Zoe was fully healed. She was back to running, yelling, laughing like nothing had ever happened. And on the anniversary of her surgery, we threw her a party not in some luxury hall, but right in our backyard. Balloons, music, cupcakes, and a bouncy house. She wore a little blue dress and twirled like a ballerina. Mia's parents sat on folding chairs, laughing, watching her with eyes full of pride. And I stood there next to the woman I loved, surrounded by the people who'd really shown up when it counted. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when everything else falls apart. Healing comes slow, but when it finally arrives, it feels like air after drowning. After Zoe's recovery, our lives didn't snap back into place, they shifted. Something fundamental had changed. We weren't just trying to get by anymore. We were building something stronger. I was different now. The man who once begged on his knees was gone. In his place stood someone who knew exactly what he was capable of. I started waking up at 5 a.m. every day. Quiet mornings, black coffee, a blank sketch pad, and plans. I studied like a student again: business management, marketing, networking. I consumed everything I could get my hands on. I wasn't just an interior designer anymore. I was a man on a mission. The business picked up faster than I expected. The client who once hired me to redo their home office now wanted a full remodel of their company headquarters. Word spread. Then came an opportunity to design a boutique hotel's lobby. One project led to another, and within a year, my small firm grew into a team of 10. We were designing retail spaces, cafes, modern workspaces, you name it. I never took it for granted. Every email mattered. Every decision felt personal. I wasn't chasing luxury, I was chasing freedom. I wanted to build something that no one could take from me, something Zoe could be proud of. There were nights I barely slept. Mia would sneak into my office at 2 a.m. with tea and just sit beside me while I reviewed client revisions. You know, she'd whisper, "You don't have to carry everything alone." And I'd look at her, smile softly, and say, "I'm not. I've got you." because I did, every step of the way. By the second year, we moved into a new place. Nothing extravagant, just a house with a yard big enough for Zoe to chase fireflies and a sunroom where Mia could read on weekends. It felt earned. And that feeling? That's something money can't buy. I repaid every dollar we'd borrowed. Every friend, every colleague, every stranger who chipped in when we were drowning. I showed up at their doors with envelopes, handshakes, and thank yous that came straight from the heart. Some of them refused. "You don't owe me anything," they said, but I did, not just the money. I owed them belief. I owed them the reminder that kindness doesn't vanish into a void, it circles back. The final piece was Mia's parents, the people who sold their house for Zoe. They never asked for anything, not even once, but I couldn't let that go unanswered. I spent almost a year quietly tracking down the new owners of their old home, negotiating, offering above market value. Finally, I bought it back. The day I handed them the keys, they just stood there in shock. "Noah, how?" her mom asked, tears already forming. I shrugged, smiled. "You gave up your home to save my daughter. Now I'm giving it back. No strings. Just thank you." Her dad pulled me into a hug. No words, just that strong fatherly silence. That was the moment I realized I wasn't doing this in spite of what had happened. I was doing this because of it. Pain forged this fire, and I wasn't done yet. 3 years after Zoe's surgery, my firm landed its biggest contract, yet a $2 million design project with a nationwide development group. We were tasked with designing their flagship workspace and commercial showroom. I brought in new hires, expanded the office, invested in technology, and started mentoring local designers who were just getting started, people who reminded me of me. Somewhere along the way, a journalist from a business magazine reached out. They wanted to do a feature, from hospital bills to million-dollar projects, the story of Noah Gray. I almost said no, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't think people would believe it, until I realized. Maybe they needed to. The article went live. Then came the TV interview. The anchor smiled, flipped a page of notes, and asked me, "What pushed you to rebuild your life like this? What lit the fire?" I took a deep breath. "This might sound harsh," I said, "but the truth is my parents left me kneeling on the floor while my daughter fought for her life. That day, I decided I would never ask them for anything again. And every success I've had since came from that pain." The room went quiet. The anchor blinked. "I'm sorry," she said. "Are you saying they refused to help you during a medical emergency?" "I'm saying," I replied, "they threw a $300,000 wedding while my daughter was in surgery. And I'm not here to shame them. I'm here to thank the people who stepped in when they walked away." It was raw, honest, maybe too much for morning TV, but it struck a chord. The segment went viral. Comments poured in. "This man deserves the world. Blood doesn't make you, family loyalty does." As a mom, I can't imagine doing what his parents did. I'm in tears. It spiraled faster than I expected. My inbox flooded. People shared similar stories: betrayal, abandonment, but also resilience. My company's website crashed from traffic. Bookings doubled. I was humbled, overwhelmed. And then, I got a phone call. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Something told me not to, I answered. And there it was. That voice I hadn't heard in years. Flat, worn, fragile. "Noah, it's Mom." She didn't sound like the woman who once threw parties on marble floors. She sounded tired, scared. "We're in trouble." I stayed silent. She kept going. "Your father and I, we took out loans. Mortgaged the house. We're about to lose it." I didn't say a word. Her voice cracked. "We need $200,000. Please." We don't know what else to do. It was surreal. The same woman who looked through me as I begged for help was now doing the same thing, begging for me. And the worst part, I didn't feel rage or triumph. I just felt empty. I hung up without promising anything. That night, I told Mia everything. She sat in silence for a while, then looked me in the eyes and said, "I'll support whatever you decide." I appreciated that more than she knew. Then I turned to her parents, told them the whole story. About the call, the house, the debt. Her dad leaned back, arms crossed. "What are you thinking?" I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to slam the door in their face. The other part feels guilty, he finished. I nodded. He sighed. Son, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean trusting again. It just means you're free. And they know it. That night, I stood on the balcony, looking out at the stars. I thought about everything, the hospital, the party, the silence, the suitcase I packed when we were ready to sell our furniture. And I realized something. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure. The boy inside me still wanted answers, still wanted them to say, we were wrong. But the man I'd become, he didn't need anything from them, except maybe to watch them realize they'd lost me for good. The next morning, I sat in my office with my hands steepled under my chin. The city skyline stretched across the window behind me, but my eyes weren't on it. They were on the black suitcase sitting on my desk. It was heavy not just in weight, but in meaning. $200,000 in cash, counted, stacked, ready. I didn't need to do this. I had no obligation. But part of me needed to see them, to say what had been sitting on my chest for years. I called my mother back. Her voice cracked with hope when she picked up. Noah, I'll give you the money, I said. But you and Dad need to come here. In person, she hesitated. I could almost hear her eyes widening. To your office? Yes. A pause. Then a shaky, okay, we'll be there this afternoon. I hung up and waited. 3 hours later, they walked through the glass doors. They looked smaller, not physically, but in spirit. My father's once impeccable suit was wrinkled, his shoulders slumped. My mother's designer purse looked out of place like it belonged to someone else. They stepped inside my office like strangers, like tourists in a place they never expected to see. I stood slowly and gestured to the chairs across from my desk. They sat. Silence. Then my father cleared his throat, trying to muster some authority. Noah, we're grateful you agreed to see us, don't, I said quietly, cutting him off. Not yet. He stopped. I looked at both of them. No anger. Just steel in my voice. I brought you here so we could talk, just once. Face to face. You're going to listen first. Then you can take the money and go. But after this, there's nothing more between us. My mother opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. I said, listen. She closed it. I leaned forward slightly, voice calm but unwavering. You remember that night, don't you? The party? The one where I begged you on my knees for help. Neither of them spoke. You didn't just say no. You looked through me. As if my daughter's life, your granddaughter's life, was an inconvenience. My father's jaw tightened. My mother wiped her cheek with a trembling hand. And you know what? That night changed me. I buried the man I used to be and rebuilt from the ground up. Without you. Without a dime. While you were sipping champagne under string lights, I was selling our furniture piece by piece. Your granddaughter's crib, my car, everything. I let the silence breathe for a moment, then continued. Do you know who saved Zoe? I asked, voice low. People who didn't owe me a damn thing. Mia's parents sold their home. My intern gave me her grocery money. Strangers stepped up where you stepped away. I stood and walked to the window, letting them sit with that. I invited you here today, not because I want to reconnect, not because I forgive you, but because I want you to look me in the eyes when I say this next part. I turned around. You no longer exist to me, my mother gasped. My father's lips pressed into a hard line. I'll give you this money, I said, gesturing toward the suitcase. Because I can. Because I have the power now. But once you leave this room, don't call. Don't write. Don't show up at my door. I've already said goodbye. You just didn't hear it the first time. My mother finally broke. She reached out, voice trembling. Noah, please. We were wrong. I see that now. I shook my head. It's too late. You made your choice years ago. You chose image, appearances, a wedding over a life. My father's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. We thought you'd bounce back. We didn't realize how serious. Don't, I said sharply. You chose not to realize. I walked back to my desk, opened the suitcase, and spun it toward them. Take it. It's yours. But understand what it cost. My father reached out slowly, fingers trembling as he closed the latch. Then I stood and extended my hand not to shake, but to gesture toward the door. We're done here. My mother was crying now, silent tears slipping down her face. She whispered, You're still our son. I gave a tired smile. No, I was your son. until the day you watched me beg and did nothing. That's when I stopped being family. Security opened the door. They stood slowly, suitcase in hand. They walked out quietly, like ghosts. No dramatic words, no last-minute apologies, just the sound of a door clicking shut behind them. I sat down, alone, staring at the place they had just been. I thought I'd feel satisfaction, or triumph, some kind of emotional release. But instead, I just felt peace. It was over. The conversation I had replayed in my head for years, done. And now, I was free. Later that night, I told Mia everything. Every word that was said, every silence that followed. She didn't speak at first. Then she leaned in, kissed my forehead, and whispered, "I'm proud of you." That meant more than anything. Zoe was already asleep. I checked on her like I always did. Her hair sprawled across her pillow, stuffed bunny tucked under one arm. That same soft breathing that once scared me to death now comforted me like a lullaby. I closed the door quietly and sat in the living room, lights low, the world quiet. And I thought about what family really is. It's not just blood, it's who shows up, who sacrifices, who listens, who loves you even when you have nothing left to give. And I had that now, not from the people who gave me life, but from the people who gave it meaning. For a while, it was quiet. A kind of quiet I hadn't felt in years. No late-night anxiety. No phones vibrating with desperate messages. No weight in my chest every time I opened an email. Just life simple and steady. Zoe was thriving. Her school reports had gold stars and smiley faces all over them. She started playing soccer, and every time she ran down that field, I'd catch myself watching her breathe grateful. Every single time, Mia was glowing again. Not because of makeup or clothes, but because peace finally lived in our home. We'd eat dinner together, laugh about silly things, fall asleep with the windows open. And me? I was finally living, not just surviving. The firm had landed 2 more major contracts. We were expanding into a second location. I'd even been invited to speak at a design leadership conference in Chicago. My calendar was full, but for once, it didn't feel like chaos. It felt like purpose. I didn't look back. But silence has a way of holding its breath. And one day, it exhaled. It started small. A message from an old high school friend I hadn't talked to in years. "Hey man, wild article in Business Ledger. You okay?" I blinked. "What article?" I searched it up. There it was. Front page of a local business journal, gray design empire funded by family fallout. My stomach dropped. The article didn't use names, but it hinted at enough. A self-made designer who built success on the ashes of a family rift. Sources say the fallout involved a 6-figure handout in exchange for severing ties. It quoted someone anonymous claiming I used the confrontation for revenge PR. What the hell? I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. It wasn't just the article, it was the comments. Some defended me, others speculated, but a few were vicious. Using his parents' downfall for internet points? Disgusting. So he made millions off a sob story? Sounds calculated. Cutting off family over money, some hero. That's the thing about silence, it doesn't mean peace. It just means someone's waiting to speak. And someone, somewhere, was speaking now. I didn't tell Mia right away. I wanted to believe it would blow over. But then a journalist from a major media outlet emailed me. They wanted a follow-up, a second side to the story. They'd gotten a request from my parents. That's when I knew. This wasn't over. I stared at the email for a long time. Noah Gray, the boy who once cried in a hospital parking lot, now being painted as the villain in his own redemption story. It stung, but it didn't shake me, because I knew who I was, and I knew what I had done. I didn't owe anyone an apology for protecting my family, but still I needed to act. Not with anger, with clarity. I called a team meeting. Just my inner circle, Mia, my business partner, our legal advisor, and PR consultant. "I want this addressed," I said. Not escalated, not dramatized, just clarified. Our PR lead nodded. "We can issue a statement." Calm, professional, direct. That same evening, we released a brief, grounded message on my personal and business accounts. My journey has never been about revenge. It's been about protecting my daughter, honoring those who stood by us, and building something meaningful from pain. The full story is complex, but one thing has never changed. I stand by the choices I made to protect my family. I hold no bitterness, only boundaries. That was it. No dramatics, no call-outs, just truth. And something strange happened. People responded, not just followers, not just clients, but strangers. They wrote messages like, "Thank you. Your story gave me the courage to finally draw boundaries with my own toxic family. You didn't cut ties, you protected your child. There's a difference." This hit home. Blood doesn't give someone a free pass to break you. I didn't cry, but my chest felt tight for the rest of that night. Not with anger, with relief, because finally, someone understood. But while the world processed my story, something else was unraveling. It wasn't on a blog or in the news. It was happening quietly, in the background. My parents were losing everything. After I gave them the $200,000, they made one last-ditch effort to save their house. It didn't work. Turns out, they owed more than they let on. Back taxes, hidden debts, legal fees. Their empire had been built on a crumbling foundation of ego and borrowed time. Within weeks, the bank foreclosed. Their house, the one I grew up in, was gone. I didn't know this because they told me. I knew because my uncle, my dad's brother, called me out of the blue. They're staying with a friend of Evelyn's, sleeping on a pull-out couch. They're not handling it well. I thanked him, hung up, and for a moment, just sat there. I expected to feel something, satisfaction, pity, but again, what I felt most was distance. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even numb. I just wasn't there. Zoe came home that evening with a school art project, cut out hearts, glued to a popsicle stick frame. "Look, Daddy," she said, eyes glowing. "It's a picture of our family." She'd drawn me, Mia, her grandparents, Mia's parents, and herself. No one else. I didn't prompt her. I didn't guide her hand. She just knew who loved her. I kissed her forehead. "It's beautiful, Zoe." And it was. Because that little drawing said what years of therapy couldn't. Love isn't biology. It's presence. It's effort. It's truth. Later that week, I got another call. This time from Bella, my sister. We hadn't spoken in years. Her voice was tight, wary. "I heard about Mom and Dad. They're not doing great." I waited. "I know you don't want to hear from me," she continued, "but they're not the same people. Everything they had is gone. They're different now." I leaned back in my chair. "They weren't different when they watched me kneel and cry." "I know," she whispered. "And I wasn't either. I didn't speak up. I didn't do anything. I'm sorry." Silence passed between us like a slow-moving train. "I'm not calling to defend them," she finally said. "I just thought you should know." I thanked her, and that was it. She didn't beg. She didn't manipulate. Just honesty. Maybe for the first time, that night, I sat with Mia on the porch. The sky was clear and the cicadas were humming. "They're falling apart," I said softly. She nodded. And I don't feel good about it, but I don't feel bad either." She reached over and took my hand. "That's called peace, Noah." I looked at her, at the woman who held me up when I was crumbling. She was right. It wasn't joy, it wasn't revenge, it was peace. And peace is enough. A few months passed. The noise faded. Articles stopped circulating. People moved on to new headlines, new dramas. But I stayed rooted, calm, steady, focused on what mattered. My family, my work, my peace. Zoe turned 9 in October. She wanted a galaxy-themed birthday party. Mia decorated the backyard with paper planets and glow-in-the-dark stars. Her grandparents, the ones who mattered, came early and stayed late, helping with food, games, and cleanup. That night, Zoe pulled me aside and said, "Daddy, this was the best day ever." I smiled and hugged her tight. It was in that hug, small arms around my neck, warm breath on my cheek, that I realized I had everything I'd ever fought for. Not wealth, not fame, but safety, love, legacy. Then came the knock. It was a rainy Thursday evening. I'd just gotten home from the office, soaked from a last-minute site visit. Mia was in the kitchen prepping dinner, and Zoe was doing math homework at the table. The knock was soft, almost hesitant. I opened the door and saw them, my parents. standing under the awning, drenched in the kind of silence that only comes from years of absence. I didn't speak, just stared. They looked older than I remembered, smaller, hollowed out, like time had carved something out of them. My father cleared his throat. "We didn't come for money," I raised an eyebrow. "Said nothing, we're not here to beg," my mother added. Her voice was low, quiet in a way it never used to be. I stepped outside, closed the door behind me, and crossed my arms. "You're standing on my doorstep," I said evenly. "You sure you didn't come for something?" "No," my father said. "Just to say we're sorry for everything. We know it won't fix what we did. But you deserve to hear it." The wind blew a gust of rain sideways. Still, I didn't move. My mother wiped her face. "You were right. We were selfish, blind, and cruel. And when we lost everything, we finally saw what we'd become." I looked at them. Two people who used to tower over my world, now barely holding each other up. "And?" I asked. "We just wanted you to know," my dad said, voice rough, "that we're sorry. We know we can't be your family again. We know we don't deserve that." I let the words hang there. The apology I'd imagined for years. Now it was real. Not perfect, not eloquent, but real. And I had no idea what to do with it. I nodded once. "Okay." They looked surprised. Maybe they expected a door slammed in their face. Maybe they wanted it. Something to match the punishment they carried. But I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was just tired of carrying weight that didn't belong to me. "I appreciate you coming," I said. "Truly. But this doesn't change anything. We understand," my mother whispered. "I don't hate you," I continued, "but I'm not opening the door back up. I built something without you. I learned how to stand without the people who were supposed to hold me up." A long pause. Then I added, "I forgive you, but we're done." My dad swallowed hard. "That's fair." My mom looked like she wanted to cry, but she didn't. Maybe because she finally knew those tears weren't mine to catch. They turned to go. Halfway down the walkway, my mom stopped and turned back. "Thank you," she said softly, "even for this much." I didn't reply, just watched them disappear into the rain. When I came back inside, Mia looked up from the stove. "Everything okay?" I nodded. "Yeah, it is now." Zoe looked up too. "Who was at the door?" I walked over, kissed her on the head, and said, "Just some people from the past." She shrugged and went back to her homework. That was all it needed to be. The seasons shifted. Fall melted into winter, then bloomed again into spring. Life didn't slow down, it just got fuller. We hired 5 new designers, opened our second office in Houston. I took Zoe to her first Spurs game, bought Mia a little greenhouse for her birthday, took a vacation with my in-laws who still refused to let me cover the entire cost, no matter how many times I offered. I'd built everything I once dreamed of and then some, but the thing I valued most wasn't the house, the business, or the press. It was the quiet, the knowledge that I had chosen who I became, on my own terms. One morning, I found Zoe sitting in the sunroom, flipping through one of my old sketchbooks. She looked up, all wide eyes in wonder. "Daddy, did you draw all this?" "Yeah," I smiled. "Before I even had a company." She traced her finger along a drawing of a small living room, cozy, warm, with a little girl's play area in the corner. "I like this one," she said. "That was the first design I ever sold," I told her, "back when we didn't even have a couch." She nodded slowly. "It's nice." Then she looked at me, dead serious. "I want to make things too, but not furniture. I want to draw stories." I chuckled. "Stories?" "Yeah," she said, proud, "like books, but also pictures. Like dreams with paper." My heart swelled. Dreams with paper. That's what we'd done, really. Took pain and turned it into something soft, something strong, something that could live past us. "Then you should," I said. "And when you do, I'll be your biggest fan." That night, I sat in my office with the lights low. I opened a new notebook, blank pages waiting. I didn't write plans this time, didn't sketch blueprints. I just wrote one sentence across the top. "Forgiveness is not about who deserves it. It's about who you choose to become." Because I'd chosen to protect, not punish, to build, not destroy, to close the door not out of bitterness, but out of peace. Epilogue: it's been 5 years now since that night in the hospital. 5 years since I learned the difference between family and real family. Since I stood up from the floor and decided I'd never kneel again, I don't tell this story to get sympathy. I tell it because someone out there is where I was. Betrayed, broke, begging. If that's you, listen carefully. You're allowed to walk away from people who only show up when it serves them. You're allowed to build a life that's protected from their storms. And if they come back, you get to decide what forgiveness looks like. Sometimes it's a hug. Sometimes it's a handshake. Sometimes it's a closed door and peace on the other side. Whatever you choose, let it be your choice. Because this is what healing looks like. Story 2. Hi there, I'm James, and I'm 30 years old. I'm employed in the financial sector. Above all, having a steady job and an apartment. I used to think that my family genuinely liked one another. I was raised with the idea that family came first. A firm base, a place where I would always be welcome, and that's what I lived by. I tried my hardest to fulfill my duties as an elder brother and to give back to my parents for rearing me. I never declined anything if I could assist, and I never let anyone in the family worry. I really thought that a family's love was unbreakable. However, I was mistaken. All of it was an illusion I had made up for myself. 2 years ago, that idea was completely destroyed during a Christmas gathering. I went back to my parents' house on Christmas Eve 2 years ago. Similar to each year, heavy snowfall covered the roofs along the roadway, casting a gentle white glow over the faint streetlights. A bottle of wine, a modest present from my father, was in my hand. The warmth from within grabbed me as soon as I opened the door, chasing the bitter cold of winter. The air was heavy with the scent of the cooking. Aromas of mashed potatoes, cinnamon-spiced cookies, roasted chicken, and a touch of star anise. Mom was in the kitchen, as usual, busy. She muttered something about having to finish baking before everyone arrived, and I could hear it. She wanted everything to be flawless, just like at any holiday get-together. Everything on the dinner table, from the cuisine to the smallest things. Helen had arrived home just now. After a lengthy journey, she appeared thrilled as she dragged a little luggage behind her. When she saw me, she smiled, but it was so weak that I couldn't tell if it was an instinctive reaction or a sincere hello. After clearing the snow from my shoulders and setting the wine bottle on the dining table, I approached my father. He had a glass of wine in his hand and was seated in his favorite armchair. He gazed into the fireplace's dancing flames, his eyes lost in meditation. "I have something for you, Dad." I waited for a response as I slowly pushed the bottle in his direction. He looked up, studied the bottle for a while, and then gave a little nod. "It's an excellent one." That was it, not much more. It didn't surprise me. Words could never adequately convey my father's delight. I had already come to terms with the fact that he showed it in his own manner. I believed I had, however. The Christmas party continued as usual. In the cozy, joyous room, glasses clinked and cheers rang out. I sipped my wine while Helen excitedly described her previous trip, and Mom told me stories about the neighborhood. Everything felt the same. Known.com. As the Christmas meal went on, it was just as I remembered, warm and full of laughing. Suddenly, Dad placed his glass of wine on the table. I didn't give it much thought at first, but then I sensed a change in the air when he cleared his throat. "We've decided on something." Despite not being loud, his voice sliced right through the discussions going on around us. Mom put down her cutlery. As though she had been waiting for this, Helen crossed her arms and sat back in her chair. With a deep breath, Dad looked around the room before settling on me. "Helen will inherit all we own." There was silence in the room. I felt a chill go down my back. I blinked despite the fire on the hearth still glowing brightly. I'm looking at my mother. She seems unsurprised. I looked across at Helen, like she was enjoying the moment. She swirled the deep crimson liquid in her wine glass as she lifted it up. I must have heard it wrong. My voice sounded oddly serene. Dad's face remained the same. "Now, your mom and I have considered this." I laughed, but it was a dry laugh, devoid of any humor. "Isn't reading out a will a bit premature?" I crossed my arms and sat back in my chair as I felt the rage building within of me. Dad looked straight into my eyes. "To prevent future misunderstandings, we simply wanted you to be aware in advance." Mom touched the table with her hands. She spoke softly, as though she were describing something quite rational. "You already own a home, a vehicle, and a steady job. Helen has nothing. The older brother is you. You ought to give it to her." My rage flashed within of me. I pushed my palms on the table and looked intently. Give it to her. Mom, are you serious? Dad put down his wine glass and moaned. Don't worry about this, James. We made this choice. Don't worry about this. I said it again in a disbelieving tone. I looked across at Helen. She appeared completely unconcerned. She had a little smile on her lips. What's causing your tension? Helen's whining twisted. Those phrases don't imply that you need the money. I jerked my head in her direction. I gripped the chair tighter. Do you believe this has to do with money? I wanted a piece of the estate, so you think I'm sitting here mad? Helen shrugged and said nothing, but I wanted to throw my fist on the table because of the apathy in her gaze. Each syllable pierced like a dagger as Mom moved forward, her voice still calm. Your father and I have already made up our minds, James. Avoid creating a commotion. Keep in mind that you are Helen's elder brother. I glanced at the deceased Helen, my mother, and I became aware of something at that very instant. All of my sacrifices, all of my actions, and all of my gifts to this family. It was never sufficient. I had had enough of arguing. The harsh scream of wood hitting the floor reverberated across the room as I pushed my chair back and got up. Mom winced and gave me a startled look. Where are you going, James? I reached for my coat without turning around, the one I purchased for myself. I never believed this house was mine. I went outdoors after opening the door. Behind me, the door banged. I didn't just leave that house on Christmas Eve. I left the delusion of having a genuine family behind. Through the night, I drove. There are faint lines across the glass from the streetlight's dull glare. The snow continued to fall relentlessly and thickly, but the emotion was always the same, regardless of how chilly it was outdoors, arising inside me. My parents said I had it all. Helen had nothing, according to her parents. My parents advised me to yield to her. I laughed a little dryly, one completely without a sense of humor. However, what about all of my actions? The roof began to leak in the midst of winter 5 years ago. In order to save them from having to live with water seeping through the roof, I provided $10 to have it fixed. When my parents surreptitiously obtained a mortgage to finance Helen's cafe, a cafe that operated for just 7 months before closing, this property was just days away from being repossessed by the bank 2 years ago. That house no longer belongs to me, even though I spent $50,000 to save it. I paid them $1,000 a month to assist pay their costs. Never be late. Not once. For his birthday, I got him a high-end fishing set. He had always desired it but had never had the courage to purchase it for himself. For the birthday of Mom, she had been admiring the new oven for years, and I presented it to her. They told me I was their pride and pleasure, and they were ecstatic. However, I was only a stranger who was more concerned with them than they were with Helen and me. She started a fashion store with the $20,000 I gave her. This time, she vowed, it will be different. And what took place? After half a year, the money disappeared as if it had never been there, and the shop closed. Like the last cafe, it was identical to every other get-rich plan Helen had ever attempted. My viewpoint was no longer needed by Mom and Dad, though. They had decided without considering my opinion. Helen was the only child that mattered to them. As I applied pressure to the gas, the freezing wind sliced into my flesh. I was on my way home. I used my own funds to purchase the house, paid for by my diligence, not the home from which I had just left. It was still early when I returned to my flat. My rage had subsided somewhere along the line, to be replaced with a strange sensation of peace. No more frustration, no more lingering questions, just one plain fact. They had made their decision, and so had I. I stepped into the kitchen and turned on the coffee maker, steam rising, bearing its familiar perfume. But it no longer soothed me this time. I poured myself a big cup and brought it outdoors, settling onto the chair on my porch. No interruptions. No calls from Mom, no texts from Dad, no phony concern from Helen, just myself and the silent night. I took a drink of coffee. The bitterness stretched across my tongue, but deep down I felt a peculiar relief pulling out my phone. I launched my banking app with simply a few touches. I canceled every automatic payment: electricity, water, insurance, groceries. One by one, they disappeared from my transaction list. Finally, I terminated the $1,000 monthly support. If that house belonged to them, They had every right to decide what to do with it. And the money in my account that belonged to me, and I didn't owe them an explanation. I opened my contacts and scrolled through familiar names. Mom, Dad, Helen. Without hesitation, I blocked them all. No more messages, no more calls, no more ties binding me to them. I set my phone down, leaned back in my chair, and closed my eyes. And then, like a flood, old memories came rushing back, carrying fragments I had long tried to forget. I remembered how, when we were kids, Mom and Dad never played favorites. Whether it was birthday presents or family dinners, they always tried to divide everything equally, so neither Helen nor I would feel left out. Back then, I believed we were a fair and loving family where affection wasn't weighted more toward one side. But somewhere along the way, things changed. I didn't know precisely when the favoritism began. Maybe it was when Helen started middle school, constantly asking for money to buy new clothes because everyone else had them. Perhaps it was when she kept failing one after another of her tutoring classes. Yet Mom and Dad reassured her, as long as you try, you don't have to be the best. Or it was when she got into college through a special admissions program, while I had to bury myself in books to secure a scholarship one way or another. I knew one thing: their favoritism created the Helen we have today. Even at 25, Helen had no stable job, no savings, nothing. She lived under Mom and Dad's protection, relying on the endless money they sent her way whenever she got into trouble. And me? After graduating college, I threw myself into the workforce, saving every penny and fighting for every opportunity to build my life. My success wasn't handed to me. It didn't come from Mom and Dad. No one backed me when I applied for jobs. No one paid my rent or covered my tuition as a student. I had built everything with my own two hands, step by step. And yet they were using my money without a second thought. They didn't feel guilty. They saw it as my duty. I set my coffee on the table, staring into the quiet night ahead. I used to believe that if I just worked hard enough, they would see me. However, I was mistaken. After that day, I tried to put everything behind me and focus on work. New projects and new controlled me out of the spiral of negative thoughts. My packed schedule kept me busy from morning till night, leaving no time to dwell on what had happened at that Christmas dinner. I never brought it up to anyone. It was over. I had decided to walk away and had no intention of looking back. I thought that was the end of it, but it wasn't. 2 weeks later, they showed up at my door. Dad, Mom, and Helen. I had no idea how they got past security, but the moment I heard the relentless knocking, I knew something was wrong. I set my documents on the table and walked to the door, not wanting to let them in. When I opened it, 3 familiar faces stared back at me. It didn't surprise me. I had expected this, but I didn't think they would arrive at my house 2 weeks later. Mom was the first to break the silence, her voice cold. James, we need to talk. I stood firm, making no move to step aside. My voice was steady, unyielding. About what? Dad stepped forward, his tone lowering, each word weighted with disapproval. Do you have any idea what you're doing? I met his gaze without flinching. What precisely do you mean, Dad? Mom clenched her fists, taking a deep breath to hold back her frustration. Her voice was harsh when she pronounced every syllable, pushing down like an accusation. Don't pretend you don't know. Why did you cancel all the payments at that? Helen scoffed, a little sarcastic chuckle. She cocked her head, her voice dragged out and oozing with sarcasm. Did you think you could accomplish it without informing anyone? I didn't answer immediately away. I stood there, letting the stillness stretch, letting the tension develop. I stared at them, the 3 persons standing in front of me, the individuals who called me family, yet never actually viewed me as part of it. They weren't here because they were worried about me. They weren't here to check on me. After 2 weeks of stillness, they weren't coming to make amends or to apologize. They were come to face me because I had stopped paying for them, not wanting to keep them waiting too long. I took a slow breath, keeping my voice as level as possible. The person you choose to inherit everything should be accountable for you. I stared each of them in the eye, not backing down. As for me, I'm not getting anything. Dad tightened his hands, his voice lowering lower, thick with rage. Who brought you into this world? Who raised you? You have a responsibility to this family. I inclined my head slightly, unaffected. Responsibility. I laughed a little dryly. Empty. Devoid of humor. Then why doesn't Helen have any responsibility? Has she ever sent you a single dollar? Mom shot back instantly, her voice rising as if I had just uttered something undesirable. She's your younger sister. She doesn't have a career yet. When she does, she'll aid us. I gazed at her for a long while, letting her words linger, a hazy promise, a shaky presumption about a future that might never occur. I knew better than anyone. Someone like Helen would never stand on her own without someone paying her lifestyle. I breathed softly, no longer interested in disputing. Go home. My voice was flat, impersonal. Before I contact the police, all three of them froze. Dad clenched his jaw. Mom opened her mouth to say something but couldn't find the words. Helen glared at me. Pure disbelief, as if she couldn't fathom that I would be this firm. I didn't care. There was nothing left to say. There was nothing left to hold on to. Both they and I had already made up our minds. They didn't get in touch with me again after that day. 3 months ago, that is. We had been silent for almost 2 years. I had just returned home from work that afternoon. As soon as I entered my driveway, Helen, my father, and I were standing there with a stack of bags. After shutting off the engine, I remained still for a few moments, gazing in shock at the spectacle. As though they knew when I would return home, they had been waiting. Helen appeared bored as she browsed through her phone. Dad was standing with his arms folded, looking annoyed as if he were getting ready to argue. The first person to speak out was Mom. She tried to sound nice even though her voice was low. We must spend a few days with you. I took my time getting out of the car. I glanced at them and then at the bags that were stacked all around them. I knew what they had planned without having to ask. I leaned against the vehicle and pushed the door open. My voice is calm. Why are you here? Mom sighed. The ancient house has to be fixed. There is nowhere for us to stay. Only a few days will pass. Are you unable to assist us? I remained still. I spoke steadily. A hotel is now available to you. Dad's tone sharpened as his scowl intensified. Don't be like this, James. We are related. Are you unable to assist your parents? I fixed my eyes on him. Ask Helen now. Suddenly, the air changed. Helen eventually glanced up from her phone as Mom stopped for a moment. I didn't take my eyes off of it. She was left in charge of everything. She is therefore accountable for you. In my case, my remarks had little effect. With controlled rage, Dad's words trailed off. You selfish, ungrateful bastard. I shrugged, my voice emotionless. You can think whatever you want. I already told you, whoever you chose should be the one to take care of you. I turned, climbed back into my car, and closed the door without waiting for a response. In the rearview mirror, I saw my mother saying something, but I chose not to pay attention. Helen's displeasure was evident as she stood with her arms crossed. Dad stood still, his face flushed with rage. I didn't give a damn. I let them go with their bags and hit the throttle pedal. I didn't go home that night. Rather, I went to see one of the few individuals I trusted, Ryan. Each of us held a beer can as we sat on his balcony. The chilly night breeze creeping through the railing's crevices. From the Christmas meal until the moment my parents and Helen arrived at my house with their bags, I filled him in on everything. Ryan did not interrupt while he listened. He only took tiny sips of his beer and nodded every now and again. His face was thoughtful. After a few minutes, he placed his can on the table and gave me a tiny twist of the head. It's not just about fixing the house, in my opinion. I leaned back in my chair and scowled. What are you saying? Ryan spoke calmly but confidently as he turned the beer cans in his hand slowly. After you stop all financial support, you should investigate this further. They probably don't have enough money for everyday costs, much less home repairs. I became quiet, like a switch turning on. Ryan's words opened my eyes to something I had somehow missed. Was this just another pretext for my parents to take advantage of me, or did they really need to fix the house? I gripped the beer can more tightly. I had to learn the truth. The next day, I made a small detour past my parents' house on my way to work. Curiosity played a role. I can't get Ryan's words from the previous evening out of my head. I wanted to see the house myself if they really needed to fix it. However, there was no scaffolding, no workers, no construction materials, and no indication of any renovations when I pulled up in front of the old house. It all appeared to be the same as when I was there last. I stood by the gate and looked around. A shiver ran up my back, getting stronger every second. But before I had time to think about it anymore, from the other side of the fence came a voice that was familiar. James. It's been a while, I pivoted. It was our longtime neighbor, Mark. The first nodded to him without raising my voice. Good morning, Mark. I came by to see how things were going because I had heard my parents were remodeling the house. Mark scowled a little and then laughed a little. He had a bewildered look on his face. Remodeling? No. The residence was sold last week. Already, the new owners are settling in. I froze. Sold the house, I repeated, needing to make sure I hadn't misheard. Mark nodded, his tone casual as if he were talking about something completely ordinary. Yes. From what I heard, they sold it to fund some investment for Helen. They didn't tell you? I didn't answer straight away. I only smiled a thin, unreadable grin. I wasn't sure if it was amusement or resentment. Then I thanked him and turned to go. I had imagined they came to me because their house needed repairs. But no, they sold it and they never said a thing to me. I didn't waste a second when I got to the workplace. I quickly phoned Daniel, a friend who worked in real estate, requesting him to check into the sale of my parents' house. I needed to know what they had done and why. They had turned up at my doorway requesting to stay with me. It didn't take long. Daniel phoned me back, but his voice was quieter than normal, laced with hesitation. James, are you sure you want to know? I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply. Tell me, Daniel sighed. Turns that when you cut off the financial support, your parents didn't do anything to adjust. They took out a $300,000 loan by mortgaging the house. A shudder rushed down my spine as I tightened my grasp on the phone. What did they do with the money? Daniel pondered for a bit before continuing. They donated $250,000 to Helen to invest in crypto. I shut my eyes, rage swelling in my chest, and Daniel let out a dry chuckle, entirely devoid of humor. What do you think? Everything is gone. Lost everything in just a few months. I didn't say anything for some seconds, Daniel continued. As for the remaining $50,000, they utilized money to meet living expenses and pay off loan interest. But when they realized they couldn't keep up with the large debt, they sold the house for $500. To repay the bank. I sank back in my chair, an enormous emptiness sinking inside me. They had lost everything. They had pushed themselves over the edge, not because I no longer stood by them. What I just heard truly left me speechless. I took a car home that afternoon. It didn't surprise me that they were standing at my door, not moving. There was nothing else they could do. Or perhaps they had no intention of solving the problem on their own. They were prepared to stick to me like leeches and eat away at me until I was completely gone. But I wasn't going to run this time. Mom was the first to move forward. She didn't appear as irate or accusing as she had previously. She seemed to be attempting to control her emotions since her voice was quieter and a bit uncertain. James, the first apologize. I sincerely apologize for everything that transpired, and I am aware that there have been many misunderstandings. My face was inscrutable as I gazed at her. I was fully aware of everything. I was aware of their complete financial loss. I was aware that no house repairs were needed. I had a plan of my own, so even though I knew they had pushed themselves into a position, I chose not to confront them about it, a strategy to get rid of them permanently. I inhaled deeply while maintaining a composed tone. Okay, you're welcome, but just for a week. The mood changed as soon as I spoke those words. Dad's shoulders eased. Helen and Mom both sighed with relief. A smile came across her face instantly. You're the greatest son ever, James. Mom's voice was so excited that it nearly burst into tears. You wouldn't desert your family, I knew that. As if nothing had occurred, Dad gave me a shoulder clap. My boy is that. In our family, you've always been the most sensible member. Helen's voice chirped with joy as she put her arm around mine. I assured Mom and Dad that they would not abandon us. I remained still as I saw their celebration and the phony happiness on their faces. What I had gone through didn't matter to them. The number of times they had left me was irrelevant to them, and I could see it better than ever now. However, I wasn't upset this time. I wasn't resentful. I just felt at ease since I knew that everything will be finished in another week. A week went by. Although they lived in my apartment, Mom, Dad, and Helen did not consider it to be theirs. They pretended that it belonged to them. Mom began to rearrange the kitchen as she saw fit. Dad was carefree and spent the entire day splayed out on the couch. Helen, too. As though this were her home, she even threw little gatherings and brought her friends over. I simply chuckled when I learned. I wasn't upset. I didn't respond. Before everything fell apart, I wanted them to savor their bliss for as long as possible. As the week drew to a close, Mom called me aside in the kitchen, exactly as I had expected. She spoke in a soft voice with a hint of caution. "James, shall we remain a bit longer? The ancient home is still unfinished." I glanced at her and then at my dad, who was enjoying his morning coffee. Helen was on the couch with her legs crossed, browsing through her phone as if it were the only thing that mattered. I grinned. "You're welcome to remain as long as you like." There was an odd stillness in the room. My parents looked at each other as though they were still in shock over what they had just heard. Helen looked up, startled for a moment. "Really?" Mom blinked. Though there was still a glimmer of doubt, her face brightened. Slowly, I nodded. My voice is calm. "I considered it. Family comes first. I'm even thinking of purchasing a home for Helen. She has matured. She needs a place to live." Helen almost leaped from her chair. "There is no better brother than you." My parents smiled. Dad proudly gave me a shoulder clap. As though I had just done the most noble thing in the world, Mom gave me a loving gaze. I was believed by them. They genuinely thought I had changed. I had let it all go and was once again the obedient son they had known. However, they were unaware. It would be 2 days before I left. I carried out my plan 2 days later. I dragged 10 suitcases to the front door at once that morning. While enjoying a cup of tea in the living room, Mom and Dad talked about their plans to redecorate the apartment. When my father noticed me dragging the bags out, he put down his cup and scowled. "Why are you bringing so many luggage and where are you going?" I paused, faced them, and spoke in a steady, calm voice. "Oh, I see. Did I not mention it? I'm going on a 6-month business trip with my firm." Mom blinked quickly, as though she was having trouble comprehending what I had just said. "Half a year?" I nodded, shrugging slightly. "Make yourselves at home. I'll be sending money every month for a little period." I saw Helen glance at Mom. Dad stared at me as if he had just been smacked across the face with a reality he hadn't expected. But then, just seconds later, Mom laughed delightedly and patted my hand. "You are such a good son. Don't worry. We'll take good care of the house." Dad smiled in approval. Helen exhaled in relief. They looked as if they had just hit the jackpot. What? They didn't know. They were walking straight into a trap I had set for them. While they were still enjoying themselves and occupying my apartment for another 6 months without paying rent, I had no intention of taking a business trip. I was already at my new residence. It was purchased a few days ago. The paperwork wasn't finalized yet, but the previous owner had agreed to let me move in early. It wasn't a luxurious apartment, but it was enough for me to start over. A place with no trace of them, no lingering ties to the past. After unlocking the door, I didn't rush to bring my suitcases or unpack. Instead, I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and dialed Daniel. He picked up almost instantly, his voice eager. "So can I start?" I squinted out the window, taking in my first breath of relief in years. "Okay, do it." Just as I expected, after only 2 hours, my phone began to ring constantly. Call after call. As if they were going crazy, the screen flashed again as messages poured in. "Dad! Mom! Helen!" I didn't answer. I simply sat there as they called and became alarmed. The screen came back to life. My mother sent me another mail. "Pick up, James. What are you saying? The home is sold." Immediately after a text from Helen, "James, where are you? Explain yourself." I looked at the computer, reading and rereading their frantic, desperate messages. And then I laughed. I wasn't sure if it was the thrill of victory or just a bitter, mocking chuckle at my own existence. My phone told me of 99 missed calls from the very individuals who, only days earlier, were enjoying reaping the rewards of their choices, but now they had lost everything. And I decided it was time to expose everything. The 100th call rang. I glanced at my phone screen and saw the familiar name flashing. Taking a deep breath, I cautiously hit the response button. The instant I spoke, my mother yelled into the phone, her voice nearly out of control. "Where the heck are you? What do you mean you sold the house?" I let out a dry chuckle, sitting back in my chair, my tone nonchalant. "So you guys find out? Why the heck did you sell the house? Where are we supposed to live now?" My father yelled. his voice a combination of wrath and terror. Helen couldn't hold back either. She yelled directly into the telephone. "You're an absolute jerk. Are you in favor of our homelessness?" I took a while to reply. I allowed them to vent their anger and experience the desperation they once made me go through. Then I grinned, a small, relaxed smile. Relax. I simply followed Helen's lead. I paused, then went on, my voice as steady as if I were talking about the weather. I lost everything after taking out a $250,000 loan to invest in cryptocurrency and mortgaging the house. Now, selling the house is the only choice. The other end of the line was dead silent. My mother's voice was tremulous as she spoke after a few seconds. "Why didn't you speak with us initially?" I gave a little chuckle. It was a laugh at the irony of it all, neither mocking nor amused. "Oh, and when you invested in Helen's future, sold the house, and left her everything. Did you speak to me initially?" One more quiet. It was my father who broke it. His voice was hoarse, lost, and no longer angry. "James, are you seeking retribution against members of your own family?" I didn't think twice. Every word was clear and sharp. "I'm not getting even with anyone now. You all are blood-sucking leeches, and I'm just releasing myself from them." My father didn't remain silent this time. He let out a roar. "You are an unappreciative jerk." "You are not my son." I grinned, closed my eyes, and inhaled deeply. "You made a mistake." I spoke softly and without faltering. "You are unlike any mother or father I have ever known." I heard my mother sobbing, Helen cursing, and my father falling completely silent. "From now on, consider me non-existent, and you'd better pack up and get out of that house. Unless you want the new owner to call the cops on you." I paused, as if I had just remembered something. "Oh, and one more thing." My voice was no longer light. It was razor sharp. "I sold the house, and I sold the furniture too. Don't even think about trashing the place or selling anything off. If you do, the new owner will sue and you'll go behind prison without waiting for a reply." I hung up. This was the end of it. After concluding the call with them, I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my vehicle keys, drove immediately to the nearest cell carrier, and requested a new phone number. I didn't want them troubling me ever again. I owed them nothing. From now on, they would never be able to find me. I had planned my escape 2 weeks in advance. I knew they wouldn't let me leave that soon. There was no way they'd go away without clutching on for more. So I made sure to keep one step ahead. I begged Daniel to sell the house immediately, even if it meant incurring a modest loss. Profit or loss didn't matter. I simply needed to break free. And now 3 months have passed. 3 months without being disturbed. 3 months without calls demanding responsibility. 3 months of genuinely living for myself. I have no idea how my parents and Helen are doing now. And frankly, I don't care. They made their choices and I made mine. I realize my narrative will cause controversy. Some will agree, believing I did the right thing by breaking connections with a family who just regarded me as an ATM. Others would judge me, claiming I was too callous, too harsh for abandoning my parents. But what about you? What do you think of my decision? And what would you have done if you had been me? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the article. I appreciate you listening.